Squishies. Welcome back to another vlog. This is Steven Universe, Season 5, Episode Change Your Mind, aka Battle of Hearts and Minds. You might notice I'm sitting slightly different place from where I usually do. I'm a little bit ahead of the couch. That's because I have my computer here, because I'm doing things slightly differently this time. There's just so much I want to say about this episode, and so many things I want to make sure I don't miss, that I decided the best way to do that is to actually play the episode, pause it wherever there's something I want to comment on, say my thing, keep going. I'm not going to include the bits where I played the episode. This is not a reaction video. First of all, those Steven Universe reaction videos have not worked well for me in the past, copyright-wise. And second of all, I'm not sure what the point would be because I've seen this episode 4 times. But I'm going to cut those bits out. I'm just using them to make sure I have everything I want to comment on commented on. So, with that said, there'll be a lot of cuts in this one, but I'll stitch it all together. It should be more or less seamless for you. So, yeah, I'll see you all in just a second. So, the first thing I want to talk about is Steven's dream that opens the episode. I don't have a ton to say about it, just really quickly, this is a really interesting dream sequence. Steven's dreams, we know, of course, are often him reconnecting with the memories of Pink Diamond. Interestingly, he does not have dreams that we've seen in which he connects with memories of Rose Quartz. All we've seen of those is stories from Pearl. The dream memories he gets access to are only ones from back when she was still living as Pink Diamond. And that's, I think, significant because that's who Steven sees himself paralleled with. His mom is the person that for a long time he felt he had to try to be, but never could. Pink Diamond, on the other hand, as we saw in just a few episodes ago, I'm blanking on the title, but the gorgeous musical number where he has the revelation that Pink Diamond's situation of being the youngest, having these 3 older siblings / mother figures who raised her, but who saw her as a perpetual child, and her always trying to catch up, and there being all these tensions that she would try to diffuse with jokes and parties, and that's him. And so he identifies with her very strongly because she's who he used to be. Not just in the sense that he has her gem, but in the sense that the younger Steven we saw in Season 1 is a very similar person to Pink Diamond, or in a very similar situation at least. So I think that's significant because one of the things about dreams is, like, you can find books that, like, purport to tell you how to interpret your dreams. They're pretty much all garbage. Because the truth is, dreams aren't messages from the subconscious. That is an ancient belief that has no actual basis in reality per se. What dreams actually are, essentially, is your brain firing at random while you sleep. They do seem to perform some important function, psychologically, neurologically, something. We're not exactly sure what it is. We just know that while people sleep, their brains throw up a bunch of stuff, more or less going off at random. And then what happens is, because the human mind is a pattern-making machine, and it's never entirely off, even in sleep. And in fact, dreams occur when you're at a relatively light level of sleep. So what you do is you automatically take those random firings and try to make sense of them, try to fit them into patterns. And so you assemble them into a an experience, a perception. Again, because we're pattern-making machines, and the patterns we make are influenced by our moods, by what's going on with us, by what we're thinking about, etc. When we're awake, more or less the same thing happens when we're asleep. We're not consciously aware of it, even when we do it when awake, but we're assembling everything we perceive into patterns, and those patterns are influenced by how we're feeling, what we're thinking, and so that's what produces the dream. The patterns that it assembles, the attempt your brain makes to make sense of it, is influenced by what's on your mind. Now, obviously, with Stephen, it's a slightly different situation because his dreams do seem to accurately reflect these memories of Pink Diamond. They're probably in his gem, and he's accessing them somehow. But they're still always reflective of his current situation, his current feelings, his current doubts and anxieties, and so on and so forth. So his dream in this episode is him, like, it's mostly an expression of his anxiety over identity. And that's actually key to the episodes leading up to this point, is that his attempt to fill the role of Pink Diamond was a regression to who he used to be, trying to solve things with fun and a party. It didn't work. He's not her, but he needs to get past the idea of being her. And in fact, what it connects is Pink Diamond's approach led to the destruction of the gems on Earth. It led her to become Rose Quartz, and Rose Quartz, ultimately her rebellion was smacked down ruthlessly. The exact same thing happened when he tried to do the party thing and tried to be her. It's not an approach that works. So now he has to figure out what does, and that's kind of what the dream here is about. Really quickly, when Blue comes in right after the dream, when she comes in and talks to Stephen and Connie, they say something about, we're going to starve if we don't get some food soon. And Blue responds, what is this, some made-up problem? That happens all the time in real life that's the essence of privilege right there. Is a problem doesn't seem real to you because it's something you have never experienced and probably will never experience. And so you don't recognize the problem that the other person is having, or the danger that they're in, or the threat that they're having to deal with. If food is an alien concept to you, then, and you're in a society where food is unheard of, then someone who needs food to survive is at an extreme disadvantage. But it's very, very easy to see that as a made-up problem. I've always liked the parable of the fish for this. I don't know what the origin of it is, but very quickly, a person is on a sea voyage, they fall overboard, and they struggle desperately to remain afloat, but they can't. Eventually, they're just too tired, they start sinking, they start drowning, and as they're like thrashing in their last desperate attempt to get back up to the surface, choking, this fish comes by, and it sees them, and it says, why don't you just breathe water like everybody else, snowflake? That's what's going on here. And that's the essence of privilege, is I don't see what the problem is. It's never been a problem for me because you've never been in that situation. You just can't see it. I'm going to be talking a lot about trans stuff and queer stuff in talking about this episode because that's very much what it's about. When I first came out, my brother, you know, he was initially supportive, then a little bit uncertain, and then supportive again. Mostly. He does his best. But one of the things he said during that period of after the initial support was that to him, gender, as he would, gender doesn't make you happy. Was what he said. To which I could only respond, truly spoken by someone who has never spent decades trying to live as the wrong one. No, on its own, it's probably not enough to make a person happy, but it's a necessary condition for me. Maybe you're a fish. Maybe you don't need air. I am a mammal. I do. Our needs are not the same. So the fact that I have these needs and need to fulfill them doesn't make me weak or a snowflake or anything like that. It just means we're not the same, and therefore our needs aren't either. Just as, on Earth, the fact that the gems can't handle food, or most of them can't, Pearl in particular, go back to the episode where Alexandrite was posing as Stephen's mother, and the whole effort was ruined by the fact that Pearl can't tolerate food. On Earth, not eating makes the gems different, and there is privilege tied to that. It's the flip side of what I talked about way back on Jailbreak, about how on Earth Stephen has gem superpowers, but in the gem ship he has human superpowers. It's the flip side of that. On Earth humans have human privilege, and on Homeworld gems have gem privilege. Alright, continuing on. So again, it's pretty obvious that within the context of Homeworld, fusing holds an analogous position, like inter-gem type fusing holds an analogous position to, gay love and sex and intimacy in heteronormative culture. That's like they're not even being subtle about it. The demand that he apologize for distressing everyone with that obscene display, but it wasn't. It's not. There are parts of this country, and not that recently, not that long ago, most of this country, holding hands in public, if you and your lover were the same gender, was taboo and would offend people, and you would get, yelled at and treated as if you'd done something wrong. And there would be people who react just like Blue does here when Stephen says it's perfectly okay and normal. And Blue responds, in what universe is that okay? And the answer is, of course, in Stephen's universe. There's no harm being done to anyone here. So they don't really have any basis to tell him that it's not okay. It's fine. He didn't hurt anybody. He surprised some people. He upset some people. But that's not the same thing. And him being who he is so fundamentally upsetting to them, but too bad for them. Because their feelings can't trump the fact of who he is. Freedom is the ability to be your own best self. And so there is no material harm to them and no reduction in their freedom for him to fuse in front of them. But if they prevent him from fusing, that is preventing him from being his own best self, because part of being the best Steven Universe that he knows how to be is fusing with Connie on occasion and becoming Stevani. They can't accept that, but that's their problem. Fortunately, because they have all the power, they make it his. I always thought you were failing this world, but maybe if you were happier on Earth, this world was failing you. There it is. Blue's moment of realization, her moment of understanding of everything that she's done wrong in regards to Pink. And this is important because this gets to the heart of what this episode is about. Because this is not about power. This is not about empire. That is something that Homeworld is. And something that I hope the series will address. But for purposes of this episode, as we saw in Escapism, this fighting between the let's deal with it violently and the let's deal with it passively factions is destructive. And what just happened with Blue Diamond, when Steven asked her how many times did you make her cry? How many times did you do this to her? And Blue realizes that they were abusive toward Pink. That's a power fantasy, is what's going on there. That's the idea that if you could just find the right thing to say, the right question to ask, the bigot would wake up and realize that they were wrong. In reality, that works approximately one time in 100,000. I'm making that number up, but it's rare. It almost never works. When people come around on these kinds of questions, it happens very, very slowly, and it happens due to exposure. And that exposure is inherently dangerous for the people against whom the bigot stands. The people they're bigoted against. It's not a reasonable thing to ask that marginalized people do that. That they help bigots work through their bullshit and come to understand the common humanity. It's, like I said, it puts the marginalized person at risk. And frankly, there's more bigots, especially for, marginalized groups that are quite small by comparison, minority groups. I mean, women are marginalized despite being a very slight majority, but even there, it's dangerous to sit down with bigots and to befriend them and to be in contact with them. Like, that's difficult and dangerous and tiring, and it's not the job of a marginalized person to do that. Ultimately, what has to happen is that enough people in the dominant group have to become willing to use their power, together with what little power the marginalized group has, to force bigots to shut up and sit down. And then maybe they learn better, maybe they don't, but at least there's less teaching the next generation to be bigots. at least the general mood of the culture shifts. And if you can if you can make it safe for people to be openly who they are, then acceptance of them being who they are does slowly increase because of that exposure factor. It's not as efficient, possibly, but it accomplishes the whole point of trying to get rid of bigotry, which is making marginalized people safer and more free to be who they are. But the power fantasy, is being able to find the question to ask, the phrase to say that would wake them up. And that is Stephen's greatest power. I've talked a lot about the question or the answer as a pivotal episode in this series. The question was one as well. And the question ultimately is, how do I make you stop? And Stephen has found the answer with Blue Diamond by asking another question. And that's, it's not realistic, but it feels great. She prefers to be called Stephen is my second favorite line in this episode. It's not quite up there with, the greatest Steven Universe lines ever. You're just mad because you're single, or I felt worse. But it's really good. And there's some subtleties there in the fact that she says she prefers to be called Stephen. Because very clearly she's trying. She understands that Stephen is his name. But she still thinks of it as a preference rather than a reality. She thinks, which implies choice on his part. And identity is more complicated than that. There's an element of choice in how you understand your own identity and how you present your identity, but underlying that is just the hard fact of who you are. And the hard fact of who Stephen is that he is a half-human boy. At least as far as has ever been shown in the show. So that's part of it. And the other part is, of course, she gets the pronoun wrong. And that's also, she's trying, but to the gems, he is a neopronoun. They stumble over it the way that, some binary people stumble over pronouns like Z, or what's a neopronoun? I'm blanking because the only friend of mine who uses neopronouns uses Z, but we'll go with that one. It's sometimes hard to remember to refer to a person as Z rather than she or he or even they. And even they, some people make a big show of struggling with, even though it, singular they is centuries old and people use it all the time for a person whose gender is unknown. But the point stands, the concept of boy is foreign to them. Just like the quote-unquote made-up problem of food. It's something they don't really understand, but as we saw in the scene prior to this, Blue takes Stephen and Connie to eat. And she's confused and a little grossed out by what they're doing, but she does accept that it's something they need to do now, because Stephen has used his power of asking the perfect question that gets the bigot to realize what they've been doing wrong. And so just like that, she's trying. She's learning. And that's the thing with misgendering in general, at least in my experience. If someone is making a genuine effort, I might correct them as a way of helping them with that effort, but it doesn't really bother me if they mess up because I know that they're trying, and that's the part that matters. It's when someone misgenders me because they believe that I'm not the gender I am, or insist that I'm not the gender I am, or they're just too lazy to make the effort to think past their assumptions. That's when I get, that's what hurts. And that's what I will react to with, online blocking, that I'll react to with anger, that I'll react to in some way to protect myself. Because it's not the misgendering itself that hurts, it's the malice underlying it. The awareness that the person is doing it because they wish me ill, or because they do not accept who I am, which is the same thing. So, they're at best being the fish trying to pour water down my throat after I've gotten to land and am breathing fine. Because they still refuse to believe in this whole air thing. More likely, they're just assholes. By contrast, Blue here is trying. And I think knowing that Sugar was one of a large number of storyboard artists on this, but almost certainly overall in charge of the writing, and is non-binary herself, I am sure she is aware, she noticed that Blue Diamond is misgendering Steven here, and that misgendering is deliberate, and that the fact that Steven reacts happy about the Steven part and not upset about the she part is important. He's aware that she's trying.
What are you talking about? You can't keep bending the rules for her, Blue. She has to set an example, and we have to set an example. If we bend the rules for her, we have to bend them for everyone.
Well, maybe you should.
Yellow protests, if we bend the rules for her, then we have to bend them for everyone. To which my answer is yes, good, do that. Rules are dumb. If rules are hurting people, bend them, break them, change them. Because they're fundamentally less important than people. Rules are just made up. We made them up. We can change them. We can make up something different. If they are not doing what we want them to do, if they are causing pain, saying, well, that's the rules, is just absurd. And frankly, cruel. But there is something I've been starting to understand that I had never quite gotten before. But there's been some psychological research over the last couple decades into how people make moral decisions. Not trying to figure out what's right and wrong using psychology, but trying to figure out when people think about moral questions, what kinds of things are they considering. And one of the patterns that has emerged is that there seems to be a divide between people who think about morality primarily in terms of helping and harming, where their instinct is more or less utilitarian, except that you can find utilitarians on both sides of this divide. But the key thing is that they're focused on outcomes. And they're focused on the real human cost and benefit. The other group, the rules are the point. And if the rules create suffering, then that suffering is good, because the rules define what is good. If following the rules makes you unhappy, that is an obstacle to be overcome in pursuit of the moral truth. And if following the rules makes people around you unhappy, the rules are still what's right. So obviously their negative reactions are just an obstacle in the path of doing what's right. That second way of thinking about it is just fundamentally alien to me. Because whatever the rules are, you made them up. Or you adopted them from someone else who made them up. So what basis do you have for them, if not that people are getting hurt? But that's clearly how Yellow thinks about this. The rules come first. And any suffering they create is an unfortunate side effect. But breaking the rules would be worse because it's breaking the rules. And like I said, that's just a fundamentally alien to my way of thinking, where ultimately rules are tools, and if they're not doing what you want them to do, discard them and find another set of rules. It's not amoral at all. I've actually been accused of being, morally... what's the term I'm looking for? I've been accused by people of being, overly moralistic plenty of times. But the essence of morality is not rules. Rules are one tool that can be used to support moral behavior, but they're far from a perfect tool. Ultimately, moral behavior is working to make the world a better place. And so, are you? If breaking the rules achieves that, or changing the rules, or bending the rules, then absolutely do it. And that's the thing. Once again, Yellow doesn't have an answer to that question. It's not quite the worldview-shattering question that, is the power fantasy here, but it actually does shut her up for a second, and that's part of the fantasy, is this fantasy of a world where people care more about people than they do about rules. Didn't we hurt Pink? Is another question that comes close. It's still not quite the shattering question. I just realized shattering in regards to gems has pretty specific meaning, but I'm going to stick with it because I kind of like that. But didn't we hurt Pink, Blue says. And they did. They did everything right according to the rules, but Pink couldn't fit into that because the rules were failing her. And she suffered for it. And Yellow, we can see written all over her face that Blue is right. She's suffering too. But again, for that rules-based view of morality, suffering proves that you're being moral. Doing the right thing even when it's hard. And yeah, doing the right thing even when it's hard is important. But what does hard mean? And what does the right thing mean? Doing the right thing should, like I said, it should make the world a better place. Rebecca Sugar doesn't talk about religion much, but her father has said that she and her brother were raised with, quote, Jewish sensibilities. She does come from Jewish ancestry. And Jewish ethics and Christian ethics have a fundamental difference. To say that that difference maps onto the divide I've been talking about is an oversimplification to the point of being ridiculous, because you'll find plenty of people with both those approaches in both groups. But, that said, the core concept of Jewish ethics is tikkun olam, the healing of the world. There's a ton of rules in the Jewish religion, but there's also a ton of argumentation around those rules. There's a lot of people who, myself included, who reject most of them as being either no longer applicable or incorrect, like just incorrect in the first place, excessively rulesy. But the core principle remains to heal the world, to make it better, to fix it. In the fundamental Christian ethos, though, is doing the right thing in agony. It's obviously Jesus suffering on the cross, but also like that morality involves creating a lot of suffering because of that whole, hell thing. Now again, obviously not all Christians believe in that. Not all Christians believe in it the same way. This is a drastic oversimplification, and I'm not saying that, that's the source of this difference at all, because I don't think it is, because again, you find people who approach things both ways across all religious views, including lack thereof. But I do think it's illustrative. I don't think it's an accident that Stephen is the gem who exemplifies screw the rules, I'm going to help people, and the one who has healing powers. Does this look perfect to you is the question that finally breaks Yellow Diamond. It's the thing Stephen finds to say that finally gets through to her, that finally gets her to realize that the authority that she is allowed to set the rules that cause all this suffering, because ultimately any rule set, any moral rule set that is inflexible like that comes from somewhere. Like I said, any set of rules, somebody made them up. And so there's some authority behind it. It's a fundamentally authoritarian way of looking at the world. That authority might be tradition. The people in the past who for some reason are assumed to have been better at morality than we are now. It could be a leader, as is the case with White Diamond. It could be a text. It could be a philosopher. It doesn't really matter what it is. The point is that there's some authority that gets to set the rules for some reason. And for Yellow Diamond, the justification is the perfect empire of the Crystal Gems. White Diamond's rules keep the empire running smoothly. And that's often the justification used for oppressive rules, is they maintain order. They keep things smooth. They keep things as they've always been. But keeping things as they've always been means keeping the people who are suffering always suffering. It makes it impossible to fix things. It makes it impossible to make the world a better place. And that's what Stephen points out to Yellow Diamond and finally gets through to her. This perfect set of rules has resulted in Blue Diamond crumpled, wounded, essentially. Yellow Diamond in agony, emotionally. Pink has, from Yellow's perspective, transformed into this creature, and rebelled. And White has disappeared almost entirely. She's almost never seen or heard from, and things are crumbling as a result of the fight. This is not perfection at all. And so the justification for the rules is no justification at all. The only reason to follow a rule set is because it works. The only reason to follow a rule set is because it worked. But look around you. Did it? Not really. Not perfectly. And if it's not perfect, then there's room to improve it. And if there's room to improve it, then under the conception of morality that's based on harm and benefit and making things better, if there's room to improve it, then there's a moral duty to improve it, which means changing it. And one more point that Stephen follows up with quickly. If every pork chop were perfect, we wouldn't have hot dogs. That the effort to perfection is inherently flawed because it's inherently constraining. You reject everything that seems imperfect, you reject everything that doesn't fit in the rules you've decided to follow, and the result is you cut out so many things. You create suffering for yourself and others. Whereas if you reject perfection according to arbitrary rules, and instead pursue better according to what makes people happier and more able to be themselves, then people get to be happier and more themselves, which seems rather like a good thing. Stephen asks Pearl to dance with him when he pulls her out of her gem. That's, of course, a callback to Mr. Gregg, and I love it because I love that episode. And so he's calling back to the moment when Pearl quote-unquote ruined the song. And part of Pearl's character arc has been getting over Rose, and that episode was a crucial moment because accepting what Rose did and that it wasn't Greg's fault or Rose's fault or anyone's fault, that it was a thing that happened, was a huge part of her arc and led to the character development that allowed her to be the person we saw in Last One Out of Beach City, which is where the whole jacket part of the redesign comes from, and the pants, and it's all just showing us just how far that she's come. In the same way, Amethyst's "Go Steven, I'll be fine" is in its own way a callback to I'm blanking on the episode's title, but it was the one where Stephen and Amethyst were looking for Ruby and had that amazing talk on the beach. And Amethyst saying to Stephen, "Don't worry about me. Do what you need to do. Feel what you need to feel. You don't have to take care of me." And it was a moment of immense maturity and growth for her. So I really like those two little callbacks in this rapid sequence of gems, of fusions. Sunstone breaks the fourth wall. So does Sardonyx. Fusions enhance the powers of the gems in them. Sapphire's future vision was one-dimensional. It showed her a single path of what would happen. Fusing with Ruby, Garnet's future vision shows more. Ruby introduces the unpredictable, the element of freedom, which you'll notice tied fundamentally with love in Steven Universe. That's important, and we'll get back to that. But because of that, they see many possible futures. Her future vision is, as a result, wider, more powerful. She sees more. The next upgrade to future vision from that is breaking the fourth wall. We don't see that in her fusion with Amethyst, but we don't see much conversation from that fusion at all. I'm blanking on its name. we get a lot of dialogue from Sunstone and Sardonyx. And so we get to see the upgraded future vision, which is awareness that she's in a show. But it plays out fundamentally differently between the two of them. What's the difference between the two of them? Pearl versus Steven. Pearl is very dramatic and theatrical at times. She definitely has that element to her. She's more creative than she often gives herself permission to be. Remember, she's the one who essentially designed what rose quartz would look like. She has this imagination, and she has a flair for the dramatic. So for her, recognizing that she's in a show means cranking up the performativity. It means acting like she's on stage. As a magician, but nonetheless as a performer on a stage, trying to keep the audience's attention and entertain them. Steven, on the other hand, knows his cartoons. He watches cartoons. And so he knows how a cartoon character should act. And so when fused with him, Sunstone uses the breaking the fourth wall to address the kids in the audience and give them little moral lessons in this, Sailor Moon Says style. That's a little bit of an anachronism. That's Steven. Steven was born in, I believe, 2000. Hang on, let me double check that. Okay. If I remember correctly, the blizzard that hits in the flashback episode to when Steven was a little baby is the February snowstorm that hit the Mid-Atlantic and New England in 2003. So Steven's childhood, his childhood is late 2000s, early 2010s. That's his prime cartoon watching years. More or less lines up with Steven Universe's Steven Universe is airing, coming into his later cartoon watching period. Whereas the behavior we're talking about is more the cartoons of the mid-'80s through mid-'90s. So more the time in which people like Rebecca Sugar and Ian Jones-Quartey were kids. Or, for that matter, me. I think they're 2 or 3 years younger than me. So, still, despite that slight anachronism, it works, and it works brilliantly. So a lot of people have pointed out that the shot where Steven and the other crystal gems come in to White Diamond's sanctum, for lack of a better term, is recreation of the shot from a past episode that I'm blanking on which one it was. It was first season. I think it was the one with the rotating dungeon. But regardless, it's a recreation of that shot with the difference that Steven lands gracefully instead of going splat. And that's, again, just a cute little way of showing how much he's grown. To me, more interesting is the background in the sanctum, which we first see in that shot. Looks like static. It reminds me of a little joke in, I think it's Neuromancer and Neverwhere. The novels both start with the same line. Two different people written 15, 20 years apart. But they both start by saying the color was the sky of a television tuned to a dead channel. In Neuromancer, that means that it's gray and overcast and looks like static. In Neverwhere, and again, I'm 80-90% sure those are the two novels, but I might be confusing them with something else. But in Neverwhere, what they mean is the sky is bright blue. Just horizon to horizon, bright blue. I've always found that very cute and a very interesting way of showing, the difference between times and how even in that relatively short period, the meaning of a metaphor can fundamentally change. And this idea of static, it's still used as a visual signifier today in stuff for kids that I don't know if they've ever seen static. Because TVs tuned to dead channels don't show static anymore. They just show blue. But the signifier is still there, that it indicates interference, lack of information, glitchiness, and I think it's real significant that that's what White Diamond's sanctum is surrounded with, especially in connection with the amount that her character design references, like German expressionist cinema, and especially Metropolis. Metropolis is an interesting movie. It is deservedly one of the great classics of silent film. It's also more than a bit fascist. It doesn't look it at first glance. At first glance, it's about a centralized authoritarian power that oppresses the working class, and the working class rises up against it. But that rise is disastrous. There's a line that runs through the film as kind of a recurring core theme, that the mediator of the head and hands must be the heart. And what it's referring to is the hands, the workers, and the head, the upper classes, need a heart in between to connect them, or else strife will occur between them. That sounds good on the surface, but what it actually translates to is a central authority that both of them have to listen to. That is based on rather mystical notions of a national soul. This is all really fascist ideology. And that is who White Diamond represents. She sees herself as the spiritual center, the one who is called to take care of everyone by making sure that all the people doing the work follow the rules that are laid down according to logic by the mind. And what that translates to is her as the ultimate authority. One line that really hits me, in a way, of White Diamonds is, "Your new friends are so funny. Is that what they're supposed to be? Funny?" Because it's so dismissive and condescending and contemptuous while being surface quasi-complimentary. And that's White Diamond to a T. She positions herself as the heart, as the one who takes care of everyone, as this vitally important link, and as fundamentally compassionate. She has not been any of those things. She says it herself. Pink is the part of herself that she tries to keep hidden. And the defining trait of Stephen, who is now the Pink, the defining trait associated with Pink in this show is love, freedom, compassion, the things that Ruby brought to the fusion with Garnet. That's the essence of what Pink represents in the gems. And that's what White Diamond has to suppress. And that's exactly the thing I was talking about people who think of morality as being a set of rules. They reject compassion. And ultimately, that's what has to be at the root of morality. Not, to be clear, empathy. People say that a lot, and I have some issues with that. One of them being that it's kind of ableist and shows a distinct lack of compassion for people for whom empathy of one form or another can be a struggle. Because empathy is a capacity. It's the ability to identify what another person is feeling, to share with another person what they are feeling. Compassion's different. Compassion is a choice. Compassion is a behavior. Compassion is something you do rather than something you are. And that's what morality is about. Doing. That's all that it's about. That's the difference between moral and not moral, is what you do. That's what morality is for. It's choosing what to do. What is the right thing to do? And so it has to be about compassion. It has to be about choosing to try to do things that are making things better. To do things that express caring for others and kindness, which very much is not the same thing, just to be clear, as niceness. White Diamond is being quite nice. She is also being spectacularly malicious. She is being profoundly unkind. Whereas there are other circumstances, and I've mentioned this in blogs before, there are other circumstances where the kindest thing you can do is punch someone in the face. For example, if that someone is a Nazi. It's not kind to them, but it's kind to everyone that they hate. It's the choice to do something that says to all of that person's targets, you're not alone, you're not defenseless, and these people will not be allowed to harm you on my watch. Anyway, back to the show. The flaws that White Diamond sees in each of the 3 core crystal gems. Amethyst's insecurity, Garnet's dependency, and Pearl's obsessiveness are their primary character flaws. She sees that accurately. What she doesn't see is the arc and the growth that they've gone through over the course of this series. She doesn't see that they've accepted that these are flaws that they possess, and that they have dealt with them and continue to deal with them. That Amethyst has come to realize that she's in many ways the most mature of the crystal gems, and that her understanding of feeling insecure and her understanding of where Stephen was coming from and caring about that in that episode with the beach scene is how that's happened. Garnet, Ruby and Sapphire have decided to be Garnet out of choice and to get married so that they're together even when they're apart, not out of dependency anymore. They've discovered that they can live separately. They just don't want to. So they shouldn't have to. Because if it doesn't hurt anybody else, why not let people do what they want and be who they want? And last of all, Pearl's obsessiveness is something that she has vastly grown beyond. She still struggles with self-worth. She still puts great importance on her relationships with Rose and with Stephen. But we saw it in Reunion. She fights for herself now. And that's a core theme of the show. It's what Rose said was so remarkable about life on Earth and about humans, is the capacity to grow and to change, to become something other than what we are, to take our flawed beginnings and use them to develop, to grow, but because we started flawed, we have at least the capacity to acknowledge those flaws and the possibility to choose to be compassionate to others in their flaws. White Diamond says of the people that she's taken over, now they are perfect, now they are brilliant, now they are... And every time, and I've seen this scene a bunch of times, every time my brain jumps to white, where the actual line is me. But that's really what she's done. She's turned them white. And that's important, I think, because, of course, while most of what's going on here is a metaphor for the marginalization of queer people and queer identities, a big, big part of this is generalizable to any kind of oppression. And this idea of the clean, perfect default that everything else is a deviation from, and therefore flawed, that's a core racist concept. You see it all the time when jackasses are complaining about forced diversity. That to them, there's something fundamentally hard to believe about a trans Jewish black lesbian that is less believable than a white Christian straight male. But both of those are things that exist. There's a lot of people in the world. And so those are both people that you're going to encounter out there somewhere. But to them, all of those words, white, Christian, male, cis, straight, etc., are default. And everything else is a deviation away from them. So every word in, what did I say? Whatever it was. Black, trans, Jewish woman. Every word of that is a step further away and therefore requires that little bit more of explanation. Which is bullshit. But this idea of everyone really is the same, except that some people have flaws that take them away from the default, is kind of at the heart of a lot of bigotry. And a lot of it is rooted in racism. A lot of it started in racism and sexism and kind of spread from there. Because, take gender, for example. There's a lot of other cultures where their conception of gender did not line up precisely with the European conception of gender. They may have defined the boundary lines differently, had 3, 4, however many genders, etc. But European colonial powers imposed the white Western concept of gender on them. At the same time, a lot of gender policing is rooted ultimately in sexism. Julia Serrano has some really good stuff on this. She talks about kind of the two forms of sexism. The one side that insists on these things are masculine and these things are feminine and never the twain shall meet, and the other side that's masculine better than feminine. And that you have to tackle both of these, and that both of them are in play in both homophobia and transphobia. If you live your life by rules, and the idea that suffering for the rules is good, then when someone says, that rule hurts me, what you hear is that they're weak. Because when you live your life, when you live your life according to, here are the rules, following them is good. If it causes you suffering, do it anyway. If it causes others suffering, do it anyway. When you do that, weakness and failure and immorality all become the same thing. They're all not following the rules. And so, when someone says, I'm not going to follow that rule because doing so causes me harm, that doesn't engender a reaction of compassion. That engenders a reaction of suck it up, snowflake. Because it becomes impossible to tell the difference between I'm not going to follow that rule because I don't feel like it, and I'm not going to follow that rule because doing so makes the world a worse place by causing me or others suffering. That's what's going on here when White Diamond tells Steven he wants to be the best of the worst. She is unable to wrap her brain around the idea of compassion as a moral force. She may say those words, but that's just fundamentally not how her conception of morality works. And so, for her, the only explanation for why someone would say, I'm not going to follow the rules because they cause suffering, is weakness and failure. And then when they gather together with other people for whom following those rules causes suffering, so they reject them and try to live their own way, well, the only explanation there is that they're all trying to escape from responsibility. Which isn't what's happening at all. Generally speaking, they're taking on responsibilities to each other and to the world around them. And in a very real sense, following rules instead of compassion and evaluating situations on their own and, figuring stuff out is in itself an abdication of responsibility. Namely, you're not taking responsibility for your own moral decisions. You're locating them in some other authority. Even though White Diamond is the authority, she does that. The rules are the rules because they're the rules. She's in charge because the rules say she's in charge, and the rules are what they are because she's in charge and she says that's what they are. It's the classic circular logic by which authoritarian leadership operates. The power that Pink Steven demonstrates with the "she's gone" scream that creates that crater and throws back White and all of her puppets. The shield that he uses to block her attempts to take him over with her light. He's incredibly powerful, and I've seen a couple different ways that people have tried to interpret this. The most common seems to be that Pink Steven is raw power, and human Steven, has all the compassion and emotions that hold that back and channel it and keep it from becoming this destructive force. But I don't think that's true. I think that yes, the gem powers are located in Pink Steven, and yes, as a diamond, Pink Steven is incredibly powerful. But it's also the case, White Diamond commented earlier, she doesn't like spreading herself thin by taking over so many people. She's using her powers, she's straining. And so she's actually a little weakened at this point. The other thing is, we see caring and emotion from Pink Steven. He doesn't have much in the way of affect until he touches human Steven. But nonetheless, the minute Steven falls, Pink Steven immediately turns to look at him and starts walking towards him. Pink Steven is focused entirely on Steven. Because Pink Steven is self-love. Pink Steven is exactly what Rose said in her video. Every time you love being yourself, that's me loving you and loving being you. She became the gem within Steven. She died and was reborn as Pink Steven, and Pink Steven is made of love, just as Garnet was. And as we learned way back in the first season finale, that is an immense power. White Diamond can't control that, because we've already seen that association between love and freedom. Because an essential part of real love is loving people for who they are. And freedom is the freedom to be who you are. Freedom is the freedom to love and be loved. That's ultimately the only freedom that matters. The freedom to be who you are and express who you are. Everything else, every kind of freedom worth having, stems from that core. And anything which limits people's ability to do that is not real freedom. It's power and the exertion of power, and that's a completely different animal. I only want you to be yourself, White Diamond says. She can say the right things, but in her mouth they twist, and they mean something that's different from what they really mean. I only want you to be yourself, and if you can't do that, I'll do it for you. It is so creepy, and such a great expression of that kind of social oppression. That kind of denying people being able to be who they are. She doesn't want Stephen to be himself. She wants Stephen to be Pink Diamond's self. She wants him to be who she has decided he should be, not who he knows he is. And she's going to force it for his own good. Because remember, good for the White Diamonds of the world is defined by rules, expectations, norms. It's a rigid hierarchical structure into which you must be slotted. And if you're a square peg being pounded into a round hole, then she will pound away until your edges are torn off, no matter how much it hurts, and she will jam you into that round hole. It's truly hateful, and yet she is able to believe that it's not rooted in hatred at all, that it's a form of love, because she's convinced herself that the real Pink Diamond is the one in her head. And if the reality doesn't fit that, then the reality is wrong and must be repaired. Because it's the rules that matter. All Stephen says when Pink Stephen knocks all the gems flat, all the puppets and White Diamond flat, Human Stephen says, "No, stop, you're hurting them." It's not that the emotions or even the compassion and the capacity for love lie in Human Stephen. It's that Pink Stephen is self-love, like I said. Human Stephen is compassion and love for others. And those come directly from his parents. Rose was motivated to rebel for herself, and she always had that selfish streak. Greg has always been very compassionate, very caring about others, but he really struggled, especially when he was younger, and we saw that in that one flashback episode. He really struggled to find any direction in his life or to do anything other than just love Rose Quartz. And it really took a big push for him to realize that he did still need to make something of himself and to be something other than loving Rose Quartz. The two together are what makes Stephen. The two together are what make his profound depths of compassion and caring and shared joy at life possible. I'm me. I've always been me. That's easily the best line in this episode, and it's one of the best lines in all of Steven Universe. It's not as good as "I felt worse," or "You're just mad because you're single," or even "I'm made of love," but it belongs on the same tier as them. The Stephen Baxter animated sequence is very emotionally impactful, but it's what comes at the end of it that to me is the biggest thing. I'm me, I've always been me. Because the thing about Stephen Baxter is he's a legend. I don't know what he charges, but it can't be cheap. And he does the jobs that he wants to do. So, unless you're Adventure Time and you're going to make a joke out of the whole thing, you hire Steve Baxter to do 30 seconds or a minute of animation, and you make damn sure that you're hiring him for the most important character moment in the work. Whatever you're doing, movie, show, whatever. If you're bringing Steve Baxter on board, then it just doesn't make any sense to do anything else. Which is why it's funny that Adventure Time, that's why that joke in Adventure Time is funny. That they used Steve Baxter to animate this utterly absurd character that really doesn't have much to do with anything. But here, it is the most important moment. It's an incredibly important moment, and it's an incredibly trans moment, This is very blatantly a very queer show, and this is a very queer episode of a very queer show, and in the heart of that is this incredibly trans moment. Because that's what it was like. My entire life, I felt like there was something inside me that I was afraid if it ever came out. Just like Stephen's fear of what could happen if his gem were ever removed. His confusion about it. His fear that when it comes down to it, he's really just his mom and she did horrible things. Stephen loves himself to a degree that I never did at that age. So it's a little different for me. But I was deathly afraid of whatever it was lurking inside me that I was hiding from myself. And I knew that I was doing it. I knew that there was something at my core, at the very center of who I was, that was terrifying. And that no one could ever be allowed to see, myself included. I didn't let myself know what it was. Until I did. Until I looked at the me inside of me and saw her for the first time and loved her. All of my self-love was being carried inside of her too, which is why up until I met her, I never had any. And in that moment, she and I became one, and I became me. And I'd always been me. I'd doubted it, I'd feared it, I'd run from it. But I was me, and I've always been me. And that is a joyful thing. And that's what's captured so perfectly in this moment. It's also a recreation of how Greg danced with Rose after their first real conversation. And it's a recreation of how Ruby and Sapphire, ignoring all else the moment they saw each other, just went to each other and held each other and spun around in the same way. They're made of love, just as Steven is made of love. Because every fusion we've seen, prominent fusion, there's the one-off ones, the occasional ones, but fusing has always been about intimacy and about love. And it's been about straightforward love between Garnet and Sapphire, or Ruby and Sapphire to form Garnet. It's like romantic love. It's been about this kind of ambiguous, too young for sexual romantic love, but a very, very strong friendship that could very easily go in that direction when they're a little older, between Steven and Connie that forms Stevani. The warped, abusive love that formed Malachite. But Steven is a fusion of Steven and Steven. Steven and the Stevens. He's a fusion of Steven and Steven, and that means he's about self-love. But just like all the others, he's made of love. The question that finally breaks White Diamond is, what's your excuse? Partially, this is a callback all the way back to the pilot, which I don't believe was ever actually aired. It might have been as part of some kind of showcase thing or another, but I think it's only ever been released as a DVD extra. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on that. But it's definitely not a regular episode of the show. It's extremely different character designs. Doesn't quite fit. Elements of it got recycled in other episodes, but most notably Steven and the Stevens. But one key element of that was that Steven was using the time travel power, the same one we saw in Steven and the Stevens, to go back and make snappy comebacks to remarks. And the final, ultimate comeback in that was to him being, I think Garnet called him a butt, and he said, "I can't help it, what's your excuse?" So there's that callback. There's also, she accused him of being childish, and he said, "I am a child, what's your excuse?" She's being profoundly childish. It is incredibly childish to say that your child isn't who they are, they're who you want them to be. To deny reality and say that things are how you want them to be. But I think even more than that, even deeper than that, what's your excuse in the sense of, where do you get off? Like, who said you get to make these rules and these calls? Where does this supposed authority come from? I don't have to take it seriously. I can walk away. I can ignore your bullshit rules. I can live my life. And then you're just stuck in your misery. I was very harsh on the Thanksgiving episode, the title of which I'm blanking right now. But the one that introduced the uncle, Andy, that was his name, Uncle Andy, who's kind of a bigot towards the gems. And the show allows for a kind of redemption and correction that feels very, let's hug Nazis instead of punching them. Which I already talked in this very video about why that doesn't work. But I came out just a smidge over a year ago. It's mid-February as I'm recording this. I started coming out in mid-January. And I mentioned my brother, that he was initially supportive and then kind of, and then has slowly come back towards support, but imperfectly. A big part of why he suddenly went from support to is because, with my permission, he told my sister-in-law. The reason for that was I knew there was a very high out of all of my friends and relatives, she was by far the one most likely to come back with something transphobic. So I was 100% okay with my brother being the one to tell her, so that I didn't have to be in the room when it happened. As a result of that, I did not talk to her or see her for a year. She began very obviously actively avoiding me. And I was 100% okay with that. And this past weekend, at my brother's invitation, or actually request for help, my girlfriend and I and a few of his friends gathered at his place to help him clear out his garage. He wasn't really able to do it because he's been injured, and that injury is actually why they need to clear out the garage, because he needs to be able to come in through the garage. So we did that, and my sister-in-law was there. That was my first contact with her in quite some time, as I've said, since before I came out. She didn't say anything. Neither of us did. She didn't say anything to reject me, or really anything to accept me. She did use my name. A couple of times she referred to me by name. Like my actual name, not my dead name. And we had actually one good conversation in which we bonded on the only thing we have in common, which is that we both love my nephew and think that he's a hell of a kid. That was it. I've never been a big believer in family. I still am a firm believer that you have a fundamental right to decide who you want to associate with, and if associating with certain members of your family makes your world a worse place, then you don't have to do it. And I'm certainly not going to actively seek out my sister-in-law. But the fact that we both love Benny was just barely enough of a bridge for us to exist in the same space without a problem. Now, if she says or does anything transphobic in my presence, I'm going to come down on her. And I hope anybody else in whose presence she does it that wants to be, if they want to be considered a trans ally, that they do the same. But I don't feel the need to start a fight there and then that isn't going to actually accomplish anything. Now let's be clear here. If it actually had a chance of changing something, if she was giving some form of material support to oppression, which she is, because she votes Republican, even outside of anything else, that's giving material support to oppression and marginalization. voting Democrat kind of is too, but it's less so. It's, you know, getting into the whole politics and voting and choice of the lesser evil thing is complicated. The point is, if you're voting Republican, you're definitely not choosing the lesser evil. You're choosing the greater evil, and that has consequences for your moral standing, I guess I would say. Yeah. If verbally attacking her or physically attacking her seemed like something that could actually accomplish something, cutting off that material support, that would be 100% worth it. That's why punching Nazis is good. Because you're, in that moment, briefly cutting off support and basically reminding them that the world is not and should not be a safe place in which to be a bigot. Because that's making it better. A world that's a safe place to be a bigot is not a safe place to be who you actually are. And that ties back into Stephen's line, maybe if you let other people be who they are, you could be who you are. Maybe if you stop trying to police everybody all the time and just were who you are, the world would be a better and freer place in which lots of people could be who they are. Again, this is not to say, like, I do not think that this is at all the show taking a hug Nazis stance. Because... Okay, let me back up a little bit. I've seen two lines of argument here. One is that the show that the Diamonds have committed terrible acts and deserve to face the consequences for them. But that's exactly the kind of rules-based thinking I've been talking about. If negative consequences for their terrible acts reduce future terrible acts, then good. You know? Then compassion for their victims mandates that we do that. But if they are already making the changes that we want them to be making, if they are already changing their behavior to no longer be terrible, don't punish the behavior you want to see. In fact, don't punish, period. When you punch a Nazi, do it because... Do it to liberate the people that the Nazi hates. Don't do it because it makes you feel good to express your antipathy toward Nazis and Nazism. That's, this idea that you can fight your way up to the top and face the big evil boss and defeat them with your righteousness and your strength, and then everything will be better. First off, is just another power fantasy. It's not the same power fantasy as being able to find the one perfect phrase to convince them to change, but it is a power fantasy. It's never actually going to happen. You're never actually going to do that. Life is not a video game. But it's also playing into fascist rhetoric, because this idea of the hero who stands alone against the forces of evil and punishes them is a fascist ideal. it's fascist propaganda. That's not to say that everything involving heroes and heroism is, but this idea that that's something to do in real life, that that's good advice, is. And again, this is not to say that violence is off the table as a way of achieving liberation. But the goal is the achievement of liberation, not punishing the bad guys. That's a means to an end. And if you get to the end another way, then there's no point to doing it anymore. And then you're just creating suffering for no reason. There's a word for that in our compassion-based morality. Because my compassion for Nazis is nil. But if they're not being Nazis anymore, then good. And I'm not saying they should be rewarded for that. They shouldn't be getting cookies for that. But there's also no longer any need to punish them. Because punishment is fundamentally pointless. Punishment is just the creation of suffering. Its only use is as a tool to change behavior, and it's definitely not the only tool, and it's not necessarily always or even often the best tool. And that's what's happening here, is that Stephen has found the phrase to get through to each of the diamonds and to start the process of changing them to let people be who they are. And yes, they're applying it to gems first. And if and when, we don't know if there's any ongoing active colonization projects. If there are, and if there are lives and beings being destroyed by the Gem Empire, then that needs to be dealt with. If and then. The only active wrongdoing that we know the Gems are up to are their oppression of their own people. So within the context of the story, that's the behavior that needs to be changed. They've done terrible things in the past, but that's the past. You can't actually fix any of that. You can only change going forward. And so, yes, it is necessary for them to first allow the gems, if that's the process that they have to go through, first allowing gems to be who they are, and then allowing everyone to be who they are. I mean, Earth is clearly a good place to learn that. If they show that they haven't learned that lesson, then absolutely they should be fought. But we see in this episode not just words, not just apologies or saying, I'll do better, but actual material change in how they do things. And so there's nothing to be gained at this precise moment by further violence, except satisfying some kind of impulse for vengeance. Which, fine, if that's what you feel, but own that what you're feeling is vengeance and not moral righteousness. That you are not in a morally superior position when you're doing that. You're just mad, which is legitimate anger. I'm not going to tell other people what to do with their anger. I'm just going to say, this is not giving bad advice. It's not telling you what you want to hear. But in this particular circumstance that the writers have produced, which is no more of a fantasy than the particular circumstance that writers produce in which we overthrow the evil empire with, our ragtag band of scrappy do-gooders. This is actually the right thing to do within this particular fantastical context. And it does have applicability to real life, to different situations than the ragtag band of do-gooders slaying the great evil. But applicability nonetheless. The last thing I want to talk about is the final song. I mean, there's other things I could mention. Shoutouts, callbacks, cute moments. But really, the only thing that's important to talk about in this video that has already gone on insanely long, to the point that I've already had to swap memory cards because I filled one, is that final song. I don't need you to love me. I love me. I don't need you to accept me. I accept me. But I want you to know you could know me if you change your mind. I thought that was a nice sentiment, a nice statement of, I am comfortable in who I am, and I don't need your approval. I don't need your acceptance or your love or even really your tolerance. I just need to be free to be who I am without you, the general you, the society in which we live, telling me to be someone different. And when and if you get over yourself, then maybe you can have the opportunity to know me. Because guess what? I'm awesome. That moment in which I met myself and loved myself, I discovered that that horrible thing inside me that I was so afraid of is named Jenny, and she's awesome. And if you're going to be a bigot, bye. You don't get any of that. You don't get to have that in your life. My sister-in-law had a year in which she elected not to be in my life and for me not to be in hers. And I don't know if her behavior this weekend was part of her genuinely changing her mind and coming around, or if it was just her not wanting to make waves. I don't actually care. I don't care if she loves me. I don't care if she accepts me. But honestly, I don't care if she continues avoiding me for the rest of our lives. Because what difference does it make to me? My life is full of awesome people who do know me as I am. I don't need people who refuse to. But for her own sake, if she chooses to open up a little, then maybe if I feel like it, I'll let her. I don't have to, because I don't need her to love me. I don't need her to accept me. And I really, now that I really understand what that was about, that final song, I actually really love it. It's a really good response to that kind of polite bigotry. That, well, I just believe differently, or, oh, I just, have questions, that bullshit. Obviously, it's not an adequate response to genuine, violence and abuse. But to that kind of, well, it's a great response. So I think, finally, and because I kept pausing this recording, I have no idea how long this video actually is. But I think that's about it. I suspect this is the longest video I've ever recorded. But the final Pacifist Run video for Undertale might still be longer, I don't know. Regardless, I hope you all enjoyed this. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Check out my Patreon for early access to vlogs, Let's Plays, essays, and more. And I will see you all next time. Bye!